It's a very serious subject and important one. Soon after the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa, I was asked to preach at St Mark's Church in District 6 in Cape Town. Now District 6, are you hearing all right?
Yes.
District 6 had been a vibrant, if rather rundown, multiracial community, which was cleared by the apartheid regime. And some of the residents told me what happened. There was a knock on the door at 6 a.m. in the morning, and they were ordered to be ready to leave by 9 o'clock. And were transported to some land about 20 miles away, where there was some corrugated iron for them to build new shacks. It seems a little bit like what's happening in the Calais Jungle game this week. Anyhow, many of them, the community, continued to make the 20-mile trek each Sunday to come back to church. And afterwards I asked some of the women how they now felt towards the white community. Their simple answer: we must forgive as Jesus has forgiven us.
Wow.
And that's memorable. And of course Jesus himself on the cross prayed, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And then in the same way, the Prophet Muhammad, when he returned victorious to Mecca, showed a divine mercy. He called for the leaders of creation, said to them, this day let no reproach be cast on you. Yes. Allah will forgive, and he is the most merciful of those who show mercy. And then the Buddha said the same, hatreds never cease through hatred in this world. Through love alone they cease. But I could spend the evening giving quotations from the religious leaders, and many of them you'll know about it. Sadly, religions themselves often inflame conflict. And it's easy to talk about forgiveness, but I know how difficult it is, and we probably all do, in ordinary life. I cannot really begin to imagine how difficult it is for those whose loved ones who have been killed or tortured. But the only hope, I think, for lasting peace is for us to mirror the forgiveness of God. As Desmond Tutu has said, there's no future without forgiveness. I think one of the difficulties we found in the various UPF discussions we've had about the word forgiveness, that it's used very widely. And at these sessions, partly building on the work of psychologists, as well as listening to testimonies, we found recognizing the various stages of forgiveness is helpful. As forgiveness is a process, it doesn't happen overnight. And many people say you have to make the decision to forgive. And I'll give these in summary. I want to spend the evening talking about almost each one. But the first of all is that the victim feels anger and hatred. And I think they should be allowed to. I sometimes feel that there's a Christian sort of feeling you should forgive before you actually acknowledge your hurt. And then the victim demands justice, which above all is the public recognition of a wrong, and that can help to reduce anger. And then there comes a stage, or can stage, where the victim realizes that the continuing anger is damaging himself or herself. And there's sometimes this phrase that you make yourself twice a victim of what you suffered from and the imprisoning effect of it. And so you may make that decision to try to let go of the anger. And then perhaps the change is when you begin to think about the wrongdoer. Negative feelings begin to be replaced by positive ones. It may do that the wrongdoer is a relation or a member of the same faith community, and so you want to try to overcome what's happened. Or the victim recognises that the wrongdoer has a lot of problems or poor background or was obeying orders. And it's just a very simple thing. I think one Christmas we came back to our car, Mary and I, and found that the car radio had been removed. We were getting a bit irritated. Our son, who was 15, I said, "Isn't it sad that people haven't got something better to do on Christmas Day?" Well, we could say no more, but it's a little, but it's that sort of beginning to change, you begin to think about the other person. And so there's some expression of willingness to forgive. The key question, I'll come back to a little bit simply, is whether this can happen before a confession of guilt and repentance on behalf of the wrongdoer. Can the person who's been injured take the initiative, or do we have to wait for forgiveness? And then there may be some form of reconciliation. I mean, again, a light-hearted example. For one ex-husband, when his former wife married again, went and took the photographs at the wedding, because he'd actually got to know the new husband and rather liked him. I mean, this is a little thing, but can you move on? So what I really want to ask tonight, and really mainly questions, can what we realise can apply in terms of individuals, apply to communities? Now, of course, faith communities have a vital role in giving practical help to victims of violence, but can they play a part in role in reconciliation? And one difficulty is that the rivalry and hatred between communities can have a very long history. The poet Edwin Muir wrote, "Revengeful dust rises up to haunt us. History plagues us like a relentless wheel. Who can set a new mark or circumvent history?" And that's what Truth and Reconciliation Commissions have tried to do, to set a new mark. The emphasis is on healing the memories of conflict and helping a country to move forward. The recent Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Court says shaming and pointing out wrongdoing were not the purpose of the Commission's mandate. Ultimately, the Commission's focus on truth determination was intended to lay foundations for the important question of reconciliation. Getting to the truth was hard, but getting to reconciliation would be harder. Reconciliation requires a new vision based on a commitment to mutual respect to develop. Now, Wikipedia lists some 40 Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Now, I'm aware Wikipedia is not always right, but there certainly have been a lot, and the focus has been so much on the South African one that it's very interesting to compare the different situations. Now, some of them have been set up by the United Nations, some by non-governmental organisations, and probably the majority by governments. And of course, who sets up the Commission has a bearing. Most of the governmental commissions were set up by transitional governments of often very fragile democracies as they try to move on from the civil and human rights abuses of previous regimes. Or, of course, they've been looking at historic abuse. They've been, in fact, the first people in Australia, Canada, was dealing with the children who were taken away from their families. And so the ones by governments after a conflict have primarily a political purpose. And then, of course, in some cases, a general amnesty was the price to pay for a cessation of hostilities. I mean, it was the only way to get the dictator out of the country. In South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission headed by Archbishop Desmond Tutu offered an amnesty, and one of the questions here is about amnesty and justice. An amnesty to those who told the whole truth. If somebody made a full confession and explained what had happened, they were given an amnesty. Another body was recommended to have the task of recommended reparation to assist for rehabilitation of victims. It wasn't compensation, it was rehabilitation. And that commission really was rather, that part was rather inadequate, which slightly distorted the whole process. But I think the importance of knowing what actually happened to one's loved ones is very important. From reading some of these reports, it made me more aware that's also the key thing that people want for. For example, the Citizens Pact in Mexico said it had as its first demand the naming of the victims, as well as an acknowledgement of injustice. You want to know what has happened, and you want to have what's happened, injustice acknowledged. Now, Desmond Tutu repeatedly emphasised his faith in the healing power of truth-telling, and was captured in the banners which said, "Revealing is healing." This was also the emphasis of the Guatemala Truth and Memory Project. That was established by the Guatemala Catholic Church and was chaired by Bishop John Girardi, who was brutally murdered 2 days after presenting the report. He was inspired by the biblical verse, "The truth shall set you free." And he said, "Open ourselves to truth are indispensable requirements for societies that seek to humanise themselves. Atrocities refuse to be buried." And the same is, I think, true of the community trials after the Rwanda genocide. It said, they serve to promote reconciliation, by providing a means for victims to learn about the truth, the death of their family members and friends. And I could go on. A group of therapists who worked in Chile after the troubles there said, the more victims try to forget their terrible experience in the past, the more likely they are to reproduce them in the present in forms of emotional illness. The person needs to recount the traumatic experience in detail. So that whole area of just listening and being listened to and wrongly acknowledged. People also need to have the injustice they have suffered acknowledged. First of all, there's somebody to listen and actually hearing what has happened and finding out what has happened. And then acknowledgement. And this is why I think public apologies are important and not empty gestures. I think sometimes people feel, well, what does it achieve? For example, Pope John Paul II, Paul's words of apology in the scroll putting the Western Wall in Jerusalem are very significant. Because the prayer set a seal on the Church's great acknowledgement for suffering caused by centuries of anti-Jewish teaching to God's chosen people, persecution of centuries of Christian anti-Jewish teaching, which we said was a seedbed in which Nazism could grow. It was a public and a symbolic act underlining a new relationship between Jews and Christians. And perhaps rather significantly, yesterday, as we were so preoccupied with Europe, was the 100th anniversary of the start of the Battle of Verdun, in which something like 300,000 German and French soldiers were killed. That's roughly twice the population of Oxford where we live, just to think of the size of what happened. In 1984, President Mitterrand and Chancellor Kohl went there together. And they didn't just shake hands, but they held hands. And one historian, Dadot, said, Verdun ceased to be a symbol of nationalist pride. It became a symbol of peace and the stupidity of war and of a New York. I'm not allowed to say that in the House of Parliament today. Symbolic events and public apologies are, I think, helpful. But I suppose the most persistent question about public attempts to heal the past is, does the process allow justice to be done? The distinguished Palestinian Christian thinker Naim Ateek wrote a book called Justice, Only Justice, and you may want to talk about that. But on the other hand, Arthur Balfour, famous or infamous Balfour Declaration about which set up was a Jewish home in Palestine. He was before that Chief Secretary of Ireland. And when some people complained about the injustices of his policies, he replied, justice, there isn't enough to go round.
Wow.
And it's interesting, I discovered that Chaim Weizmann, a leading Zionist, spoke of the situation as a clash of rights. And so that's one of the problems of justice, where more than one people, you have some sense. To some extent, it's a difficult claim which needs to be addressed. So, to what extent how do you deal with justice? Of course, one, does it require the prosecution of those who perpetrated the atrocities? And I suppose an example of that was the Nuremberg trials. More recently in Rwanda, following the genocide, more than 120,000 people were detained and accused of bearing criminal responsibility for participation in the killings. Enormous number of people. And then to deal with it, the judicial process was approached on three levels. First, by the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda. When Rwanda abolished the death penalty, a lot of the cases were referred to the national courts. But also it went on widespread at the local level. Communities elected judges to hear trials of genocide suspects, and also planning genocide. And the court there gave a lower sentence if the person was repentant and sought reconciliation with the community. And often confessing prisoners returned home without penalty or received community services. So I think there's probably a gradation there which may be helpful, because prosecution, say, of the perpetrators of the Nazi was, I think, expressing civilization's horror of what happened. But we need to pursue it with sort of more junior officials who will say that, that's the orders they had. So that's, I think, interesting. Now, the Liberian Commission recognised that prosecution was desirable to foster genuine national reconciliation and combat impunity, but it allowed amnesty in some circumstances. For example, children who might be involved, they were pardoned. Individuals admitting their wrongs, speaking truthfully and expressing remorse. And I think the more I've looked at these commissions, I mean, you see the ambiguity with graduation and sort of degrees in it, because so often the approaches, I think, is rather too monochrome. Trials express public horror, and maybe they act as a deterrent. Is it to purge, but they can also not only purge from memory, they may also perpetuate it. So that's another ambiguity. In South Africa, I've said, a person who made a full confession was freed from criminal or civil liability. And Desmond Tutu insisted that public exposure and humiliation was a big price for the perpetrator to pay. Others, more cynically, have said it was a price worth paying. So again, the ambiguity. And what too of compensation? It may help, but it cannot bring back the dead or remove the hurt. And obviously, say, if you think of Australia, the first people, not all the land can be given back. So there's that question. At best, I think compensation is a symbolic acknowledgement of the wrong that has been done and maybe of some practical help. I suppose another question which has risen is whether the concept of truth and reconciliation is culturally conditioned. I mean, some people again in South Africa have questioned whether it was appropriate to have hymns and prayers at a public hearing. The Recovery Memory Project in Guatemala was an unofficial initiative. And I think again this is significant because some Christians try to practice what is being called radical forgiveness, by which is meant the victim which encourages the victim to forgive. And even if the person who's hurt does not express sorrow or contrition, but the person who's been injured may take the initiative for reconciliation. And Desmond Tutu, in his beautiful book of Forgiving, insists on two simple truths. There is nothing that cannot be forgiven, and there is no one undeserving of forgiveness. But I hesitate slightly because I can't forget the warning of a Jewish friend that to be kind to the cruel is to be cruel to the weak. Again and again it's that balance. Now this may seem rather an abstract and perhaps theological discussion, but I do think it is of real importance as we begin to think about the long and very difficult process of healing that will be necessary in Syria and the Middle East, when at last there are no more targets left to bomb. Because it is, whatever the practical rebuilding, the end, the healing of memories, it takes a very long time. But I want to end with the words of Kircher after the death of her husband and daughter in a terrorist attack in Mumbai. If we continue to love in the face of terrorism, we disempower the terrorist and the terrorist ceases to terrorize. Imagine multiplying this 1 million billion people around the world, and over time we will truly end terrorism. And it made me ask myself, should we pray for terrorists as well as for their victims? Only love and forgiveness can disperse the revengeful dust of history which rises up to haunt us. Thank you very much.
Excellent.